Hey guys, what's going on? It's Alexander Williamson here with the secret history living inside of your aquariums. So, today we're going to be talking about smells and awful smells. We're going to talk about some good smells too, but if you have a stinky aquarium, we're going to be talking about where that smell is coming from. Is it coming from the filter? And what about the filter is causing that smell? Boy, that looks like it could be stinky. But it smells like earth, so maybe it's not unhealthy. Is it coming from your substrate down below in the tank? Is it something like plants degrading? Or is it something else? That's what we're going to be talking about here, is where the smell comes from and what the chemical reasons for that smell are and what indications that can give you of how you can preventatively take care of your tank, or even after the fact, take care of it if things got away from you. So we'll have the quick version of the video and then the longer video for those of you who want to know all the chemistry and science behind it. But if you just want to know the quick answer, let's get right into it. What causes the smells in your aquarium? Well, chemically speaking, we're going to touch on 5 or 6 things today, and that's predominantly sulfur, or the smell of rotten eggs, natural gas, kind of sewage smell. And that can be tied to hydrogen sulfide, different sulfites, and sulfur itself elementally, and it can also be tied to methane indirectly. Next on the list, we're going to go down and talk about ammonia and ammonium, which of course, if you know your cycle of a tank of your aquarium, you know that that is the most harmful waste byproduct of things dying and breaking down and food being digested. And that turns into nitrites and then into nitrates and then broken down into different nitrogen compounds that bond with all sorts of other things. Alright, so after this, we start getting into some territory that's a little more intense. And that's when we get into the chemical that causes a lot of problems in our hobby that we can smell, and it's a signal that things are going wrong. And that is trimethylamine nitrogen oxide. And that is one that smells just muddy, a little earthy, kind of sewagey, like an outhouse or a porta potty. And you can get that in the substrate levels of your aquarium down in here when you disrupt that. You can also get that in a filter, just like this hang off the back filter here. Remember when I pulled everything up? That mud has started to clog, the silt in here has clogged this filter to the point where this bottom area could become more anaerobic. It could build up sediment and it could lack air, which is what we call anaerobic. And when that happens, we get to our next 2 chemicals, which are the worst of the chemicals smell-wise, which are, get ready for it, cadaverine. Woo! That's a name named after cadavers, as in dead bodies. That's that rotten fish on a hot day or roadkill. It's a very harsh smell of decomposition. And finally, we get into putrescine, named after putrefaction or putrefaction, which is the basically fermentation, the bacteria, the yeast, all sorts of little microbes breaking down things in your tank, in your substrate, dead animals, soil, food, what have you, biological compounds, and it's breaking it down, and it gives off a smell that to humans is very intense. We can smell 1 part of it per billion particles of atmospheric air molecules. So we're very sensitive to this, and it's a sign that something's going wrong for sure. Now, the last one we're going to touch on at the end of the video is actually the smell that's coming off the top of this filter, which is a smell of earthy kind of mushrooms and soil. It's actually like fresh rain on a dirt road kind of smell, which happens to be called petrichor, but the chemical at work is called geosmin. And geosmin is a lovely smell, and if you thought that humans smelling dead animals and rotten meat, which we have evolved to sense to know to stay away from, which actually plays a part in what's going on when you smell it in your aquarium generally, well, we can smell fresh water falling in the forest or on soil. We can smell that wet, earthy, healthy bacterial load earth smell of petrichor or that geosmin. We can smell that 1 part per trillion. So that is, other than ozone gas, that is the thing that humans are most sensitive to smell-wise. And we've evolved that for a reason. I mean, we need fresh water and healthy things to drink, as well as healthy areas to be hanging out. So let's get into the reasons why this can happen. And this is that short video I was talking about. It's going to be under 6 or 7 minutes. And your quick rundown causes are going to be for the bad smells. We're not going to even get into the good smells. Something died. So you had a fish die that can produce ammonia. Ammonia can smell kind of like urine. It can smell like Windex. It's got kind of a sharp, pungent, almost alcohol or chemical-y smell in it. And say this angelfish died and somewhere in your tank it was sitting there. That could be a cause of the smell. That could also be the cause of the putrescine and the trimethylamine nitrogen oxide or the cadaverine. We'll go into more of this later, how a dying fish breaks down, how it returns to the soil, how it becomes nutrients, what anaerobic bacteria means, and why we get the sulfur smell from anaerobic bacteria, and is it dangerous? Is that buildup of gas dangerous? We're going to talk all about that after we finish up this list of quick reasons why your tank is smelling. So your substrate's going to be the next one, like I said earlier, which it could be usually sulfur that's causing that, but there could also be putrescine, there could also be cadaverine, and there could be trimethylamine in there as well. Now, usually it's going to be the sulfide gases causing that come up in little bubbles, or if you disrupt that. So the next problem is going to be overfeeding. So you overfed the tank and the food has turned into ammonia. The ammonia has spiked. It's caused the balance to go off kilter in your tank. That may help your plants. Maybe your plants love it, but the smell of that can be pretty bad too, especially if the food is floating in a tank, say like this one, and it gets stuck somewhere back up in the filter floss. As it floats, it gets stuck just like that duckweed piece there, and it can quickly start to smell bad, especially if you have a warm or humid environment, which a fish room frequently is. The next one is dirty filter, which we just talked about, and that can also have a mixture of that muddy smell that humans tend to like, that earthy smell, but it can also have that ammonia smell, that putrescine, that trimethylene smell, and it means you need to change your filter. That goes hand in hand with fish poop or too much waste, and also with that we're going to talk about the breakdown of biological elements like leaves. So that can cause a lot of bad smells. That produces ammonia, then nitrites, nitrates, and you've got good bacteria that's trying to break it down and trying to work on it, as well as, snails and microscopic organisms in your tank. But if they're not in a balance that is right for your aquarium, and if the substrate is not deep enough or is not capped or whatnot, it can cause some major problems for you and tip you off to that. And last of all is one that we probably all know when we're taking care of multiple tanks, doing lots of water changes, and that's going to be dechlorinator. When we add a dechlorinator to the water and it just smells like rotten eggs, that's actually the sulfur in it, which bonds with the ammonia, surrounds it, traps it, and then those little pieces of ammonia that were kind of sharp little particles that cause damage are now kind of surrounded by a big fluffy pillow of cotton candy, sulfur molecules. So that's basically the causes and the chemicals. Now, if you want to stick around and really learn about this stuff and how you can prevent it, what it means, the good and the bad of those smells, and some really cool trivia, science, and chemistry, I hope you do stick around. But if not, please hit that like button, that subscribe button if you want. And if you didn't feel like I earned it for you this time, I hope I can next time, and I hope you have a great day. So I will talk to you later, but let's get into the deep dive part of the episode. Alright guys, so I think we've seen enough filters. This one's getting near ready to be changed. You can see there's some monocultures of aquatic bacteria there, some green-blue algae as it's called, which is actually a cyanobacteria. And you can see here we've got substrate that's a couple inches deep here, and I just want to point out to you that when you get down to this layer, we're going to talk about the first stinky chemical, that rotten egg smell. That's going to be sulfur, and you can find it in your tank, either in your pipes, where you have, you know, pipes leading down into other places like a sump, or into I guess, you know, really anywhere that you have water it can build up, and anywhere that you have substrate it can build up. Even in potted plants it can happen, but you're going to notice it as it bubbles up because it gets trapped and then it starts forming bigger and bigger bubbles, and soon if that substrate gets disrupted, it will come up and you will smell that rotten egg smell. Now there's an old myth on the internet slash in hobbyists way before the internet even, that is enough to gas your fish and kill them. Well, it turns out that that's just not true. They've done a lot of studies lately, and they found out that you have to have a crazy high concentration of that building up in order for that to happen. However, what it does indicate in your tank could be harmful. So it's not something to ignore when you smell the rotten eggs, the natural gas smell. And by the way, they add that smell to natural gas because humans don't like that smell. It's not so bad that it blinds you like putrescine or cadaverine, but it is strong enough that it'll get your attention. So they add it to natural gas so our houses don't blow up and things like that. So let's just take a look at some fish while we chat, and let's chat about that. So as it breaks down, waste and things make their way into the deeper parts of your substrate, you've got bacteria that are called anaerobic. We already talked about that briefly, but basically they're the ones that don't need oxygen. In fact, oxygen can kill them. And when you have your tank cycled, as you know, you can watch other videos I have on how to cycle a tank and how the cycle works and how plants eat and what they need nutrients wise and all that sort of thing. But they eat nitrates, nitrites, ammonia. The fish can't handle the ammonia or the nitrites, but they can handle the nitrates just fine. And so we use those most of all with our plants, along with trace minerals and other elements that we find to be helpful in the nutrition of our plants. But when that anaerobic layer happens, say it's in the substrate, because it usually is, then the way to get rid of it is actually to put plants in, more plants. So when a plant puts its roots down, it actually creates an oxygenated region around that root. So even though your substrate may have had that awful smell of sulfur, you can get rid of it just by putting plants with traveling roots. You don't want to put a bulb or a rhizome plant in there. But the roots themselves will, one, mitigate that bacteria because it can't grow in the zone. But one thing to note is if you're smelling that sulfur, that bacteria is actually converting ammonia and nitrites and nitrates into just their constituent elements, which then your plants and even your fish can use dietarily. So it's not all bad news when that's going on. That means you have part of the ecosystem working. So I think that's just a really interesting thing about that. it can be a bad sign, but it's not always, it's not harmful in itself as a gas usually. You'd need very high concentrations of it to kill fish. And in the wild, both methane and sulfur gases come up in the water, bubble up in the water all the time. You can see it at lakes and all over the place out in the wild. All right, so next we're going to talk about how you can fix that really quick, which is, like I just said, add more plants with roots that dig down in. Or you could cap your soil. So keep that layer undisturbed, bury it deep under there, and when something dies, when things break down, they can make their way in there, but don't gravel vac and disrupt it. That's the main key. Last thing is to clean your filters and change your, your pipes, your areas where there could be a pocket of something building up in a HOB or in a canister filter, whatever it may be. You can just do that, and that will get rid of the smell most of the time. Don't go poking around all over in the substrate. It's not necessary. All right. Next smell that we are very attuned to is ammonia or ammonium. That's NH3 or NH4+. It kind of smells like urine or Windex, kind of like a skunk. It's got that kind of chemically intense smell. So what causes it and what does it do? Obviously, we talked about it earlier. It's a waste byproduct of fish, of food, of plants breaking down, of leaves breaking down, of soil breaking down. And it's also a completely essential part of keeping your plants alive, which oxygenates the water, keeps excess ammonia down. So it's kind of a double-edged sword that we need it, but we need it in a form that our bacteria and our biological filters, there's a sponge filter back under there, that can convert it with the beneficial bacteria very quickly. So ammonia, when it's in your tank, it can build up in the water, and the lower your pH, so the more acidic your tank is, the less harmful parts per million that ammonia is. So if you have shrimp or sensitive little fish like these guys down here, you want to keep that in the acidic range if you're at all worried about ammonia spikes. And also you want to just kind of buffer that tank with a little bit of something. If you're adding all sorts of leaves and things, adding a little carbonate or calcium carbonate, things like that, will help in keeping the water values where they are pH-wise and TDS-wise once it's settled. So the next thing that we want to talk about when it comes to ammonia is how to fix any over amount of ammonia, any excess ammonia, and really that's water changes. That's just like nitrites and nitrates. And also you can you can use a cap full, you can use even double the amount if it's showing up in an API test that you have ammonia in your tank because you were smelling it and then you tested for it and you found it. Then you can use that dechlorinator, C-Chem Prime or whatever your favorite choice of dechlorinator is, stress coat, things like that that have the right chemicals in them. And what do they use to get rid of that ammonia, ironically? Sulfur, which was our first stinky compound. So kind of interesting, and that's why it smells like that. So you've either got plants capping your substrate, making it nice and deep so the anaerobic layer stays anaerobic, breaks that stuff down, and the roots export it out and also limit the amount of it in a pocket. And then you've also got your emergency water changes, do a big 50 or 60%, and you're good to go. So the next ones, they get a little bit more, how should we say, they get a little more dangerous. So the next one that we're going to talk about is going to be trimethylamine, nitrogen oxide. And that one is the smell of decomposition, organic matter, mud, death. Also, when you smell something that's recently died and is breaking down on a hot day, for instance, that's that smell. I mean, people, they make stink bombs out of the stuff that you can buy at joke shops and gag shops. So this stuff is actually water soluble, so it'll carry through the water, and it forms when something is dying in your aquarium. Now, that could be a fish that's dying, that could be that your substrate is made out of a bunch of leaves that have died, or maybe something killed your plant, maybe something's eating through your plant, or maybe there's too many For instance, snails making too much poop, or too many plecos making too much waste, and it's all building up on the top layer. You know what you can do, same with to prevent ammonia in the first place with that, is you lightly gravel vac over that area. You don't want to deeply gravel vac because that's going to take away your beneficial bacteria and all that stratification and disturb those other two chemicals as well as many others that we just talked about. The other thing you can do, obviously, is change the water and just get rid of it that way. But this stuff will be usually a sign that a fish in particular died. It's less common to just get it from plants. And it's interesting in that it's water soluble, and it is found in the muscles of and skin tissue of aquatic all aquatic animals that are fish, basically. So any non-mammal aquatic animals have it in high concentration in their body, and that's why sometimes rotting plants or a dead animal can kind of smell like fish do on their own when they're not even rotting yet, is because it's actually a chemical. Trimethylamine nitrogen oxide is a water-soluble chemical that's used in the body of those fish for various purposes around in their organs. And you've smelled this before because it's in lots of things that we actually use and eat. It's in cow's milk, it's in seafood, especially shellfish, and it's also in freshwater fish, catfish, and perch, some of the quote-unquote muddier fishes. That's part of what you're smelling and tasting oftentimes. And acidity can kind of get rid of it. So that's why we add vinegar to, say, fish and chips or catfish fries, things like that, ketchup, things that have that more acidic pH, citrus. That's why you add citrus to things like salmon, lemons and limes. It helps take care of that, and it also fixes proteins in there. So why are we so repulsed by it? Well, it turns out in studies that the trimethylamine nitrogen oxide is actually correlated completely linearly in humans with heart failure and cardiovascular disease. So when we smell it, it's a sign that someone's unhealthy. In fact, you exude it from your pores when you are having symptoms of heart failure, or also pulmonary issues. It also can come out. So we have evolved to actually want to get far away from this stuff, and probably with good reason, in that we can sense in our own species who is unwell by that. It also is linked with increased risk of stroke, as well as peripheral artery disease, and it's a gut-derived metabolite in humans usually, so smells of burps and farts basically, and it's been associated with those unhealthy things. So we think that we've evolved to recognize that and think, I should get away, I don't need to eat more of this. But that's just the working theory right now. So if you think that one's bad, to fix it, you really just need to get rid of the dead animal. That's the bottom line. Or the mud. If your filter's gotten dirty, you want to get rid of it, get rid of that filter floss, clean it out in some dechlorinated water, and things will be all right. But it gets worse, like I said. It gets way worse. The smell of rotten fish, cadaverine. It smells like a literal rotting body. Full on, it is a harsh smell. Most people cannot stand it for long. They've actually used it in place of tear gas at times. With studies by DARPA, the Defense Department's, basically their trial and error secret department of sorts. So let's see here. So when we talk about cadaverine, it is a toxic diamine, and its chemical formula is NH2CH2 in a ring, and then it is an NH2 once again. It's similar to the other one we're going to talk about in just a moment, putrescine. Man, these names just keep getting better, don't they? Ugh. And they both are strictly associated. For us, we smell them when things have died, when things have rotted and molded, and they're not necessarily, those smells are not necessarily, like with the sulfur, they're not always associated with bad things and bad health. But this one, just like the trimethylamine, it is associated with being harmful on its own if you were to consume it in large amounts. However, it's not water soluble, so when you smell it, you can be sure that it's either been kicked up into the air or that it's around in the environment with such an abundance that it's going to cause a problem for us as a species. It's probably why we've evolved to smell it and not like it. You know, you will find it oftentimes in bean sprouts. It can start to form when you get bean sprouts that start to mold, and oftentimes E. coli will form there. Fecal coliform bacteria forms in the same environment. So while it itself usually does not concentrate in amounts large enough to cause problems, we can sense it 1 in a billion particles. And so when you get millions or hundreds of thousands of particles of it in your aquarium, because a shrimp, a fish, some plants, something died in there, something's breaking down, deteriorating, and not being taken care of by your biological filters, well, you're going to know about it. So that's cadaverine, and its natural role in animals is actually pretty darn important. On the inside, it helps cells survive in acidic pHs, and it protects cells that are starved of inorganic phosphates, which regulate metabolism. So in anaerobic conditions, the ones that cause sulfur, and what in the hobby, there's been the myth that, you know, the sulfur is so dangerous for years. In that same environment, but within your body, essentially, in the anaerobic, no oxygen zones, it protects things. And in fish, it's even more useful. They use it all throughout their body to get rid of both carbon dioxide in their blood and muscle tissue, as well as urea, which is a waste byproduct, you know, similar to ammonia, or similar to when you work out and you build up acids that come out of your muscles that are being burned. It's a waste product, and it can then be dealt with. But it's dealt with internally, so we don't smell it until the animal dies, and then other bacteria are able to release it from the other things it's bonded with in its course of useful duty. Alright, so the way to fix that one is definitely just to remove things like down here we've got substrate debris. We've got some sort of maybe mold going on. It's probably food that was too old. See that white stuff there? That would be something that could be causing a foul smell. It could be, like I said, a dead shrimp. It could be too old of leaf debris that's just started to build up ammonia and other things. So it's really a sign that your environment may not have a fully functioning ecosystem that can sustain itself without you helping. Because after a while, tanks do get to that point where they kind of take care of themselves. But they need a deep substrate generally, or a very organic, rich substrate with lots of water changes. So water changes will also help that, but really it's more of a sign that something has gone wrong and you need to pay attention. Now, putrescine is exactly the same. You know, the other thing is these smells can get tied to fats. They're not water soluble, the putrescine and cadaverine, and they can, you know, the little the slicks of, it looks like gasoline that forms on your water a lot of times if you don't have a lot of movement in your aquarium. What that can be is protein films, and it can bond with that and then get stuck all over your filter floss, and then from there it just gets more and more foul as it builds up. So that's one that you want to get rid of as soon as you can. So in other life forms other than the fish and the humans, I said it was very useful in the fish, but it also helps by signaling in plants and also fungi. It's involved with regulating a lot of different processes, and we kind of get a hint of that foot smell in cheeses with beneficial bacteria, but we can also see it in mushrooms that just smell like not just earthy, like that nice smell of earth, but that kind of muddy, swampy, pungent smell of rotting earth that you get with some mushrooms, as well as, you know, cheeses or fermented things, like that sharp note on kimchi, or that sharp note that you can get in other fermented foods. Now, because of this, in plants, it regulates cell signals, as well as potassium and salt do that as well. And it uses an ion form of it. Now, it's also an important raw material for the chemical industry, because putrescine actually breaks down into a lot of different nitrogen and ammonia based compounds, which are great for your plants. And like I said, it uses them for signaling chemically in a lot of different systems, from the roots to rhizome systems to even flowering signals in plants. It helps the hormones and other chemicals in a plant move around. So just something that I found kind of interesting, how a lot of these things that smell so bad and are associated with death, they are a bad sign if we smell it, but not in their own being. Only the trimethylamine is really one that accumulates and gets very poisonous, and it is associated and also the ammonia, I should say, sorry. But the other stuff is less likely to accumulate in any amount like that naturally that will cause problems. It's more a hint that you need to work on some element of your ecosystem. So after we have talked about these stinky things, let's talk about the wonderful one as a way to end this little talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you like this. I'm going to post for my Patreon supporters as well as my subscribers on YouTube. I'm going to post all my sources. Here I've got like a little outline on the phone, as well as really interesting articles that were related to this about why we can sense these things, studies going on, and also things like how petrichor and the geosmin, or that smell of rain on fresh earth, that a lot of people really like that smell. Well, it turns out springtails, that is the chemical that they eat and survive on the most. So there's some really interesting little things if you've got, you know, a terrarium or riparium or some sort of ecosystem going on that's not just aquatic, but also just has earth in general. That's where you start to actually, you might find these articles helpful in ways you may not have expected, thinking they're just stinky. So you can check that out, and you can do that by just clicking the join button. But let's finish this out. So when you're cooking, of course, like I said, you want to use acidic things like vinegar or citrus, and you'll get rid of all these kind of acrid, putrid, rotting smells. Also, salts can draw out the moisture, and the moisture carries those smells on all of them except the putrescine, which is carried through fat, and that's where the acidity comes in to help. But when we're talking about the petrichor and the good smells, the geosmin, it is just that smell of a nice sunny day. And geosmin combined with 2-methyl sorbol borneol is a concentrate that builds up in fatty skin and dark muscle tissue. And what it does is it's the last stage of the nitrogen cycle. So it's nitrogen, it's a chemical that helps facilitate in fish and in other life forms. It helps facilitate the last stage of decomposition, in which bacteria are not going to be able to use that. They're not going to grow from it. Plants are not going to grow from it necessarily. It's been broken down into literally single sulfur, single hydrogen, and single whatever it may be, various atomic elements rather than molecules of these other elements, which are considered fertilizers, or they could be nutrients and things like that. But basically it turns it back into building blocks, and that's why they think between it being a signal for rain and fresh water for humans. They think that we've evolved that ability to smell 1 in a trillion particles of geosmin, because it also tells us that that environment is relatively finished with its bacterial and fungal activity. It's humus, it's fresh earth that is ready for use however we see fit. It does obviously have bacteria and things. It's not a sterile environment, but it probably means there's less harmful bacteria in general than if you don't get that smell. And that's really the smell I have in this aquarium, which is a great sign that I get that smell of fresh mushrooms and earth even when I see a muddy filter like that. So I know there's enough oxygenation, there's enough biological breakdown on all the surface areas as well as the sponges and the substrate, and I'm breaking down that ammonia, I'm breaking down those nitrites, and the sulfur even is escaping and things like that, or it's trapped and it's being used by the plants. And all of that adds up to a healthy ecosystem. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please hit that like button if you like these deep dives. And also, unlike any of the videos in the past, this one will have a bunch of info on the research I did. So I hope you like that. Let me know in the comments if you find that cool or helpful. And like I said, just join that $4.99 tier or up. That's the second level tier, and all these resources will be available to you to then look through and make your own conclusions, and maybe it'll help you out with your own setups. Alright guys, I'll talk to you later. Have a good one. Take care of the critters you keep, the people around you, and of course yourself, or you can't do those other things. I'll talk to you later, next time on The Secret History, living in your aquariums. Dun, 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 dun. Bye guys.